brief explanation of where we are with finances for sewer and water. You can see that those enterprise funds are quickly becoming a $10 million a year business. An explanation on free cash, as well as a look back at where we were 4 years ago with free cash, and you can see some of the challenges that we're dealing with. Capital budgeting, the override info, so again, a few slides explaining that, and what I would call the to-do list, things that we need to be looking at going forward into the next year. The budget as set up, as I said, is $68 million. That's not the only component of funding that we utilize in looking at the total revenue needs for the town. We have, right down the line, we have offsets that are shown as revenue on the cherry sheet, but they go direct appropriations. I explain that almost each year. So we have to show that as a revenue yet an expense on this side. We have state charges. Those charges total between the offsets, the state and county assessments are up about $6,000 for this year. Far better than we had anticipated, but that's not the final number. Once we get an idea when the House and Senate release their budgets, we're likely to see a change in that charter school number. This past year, which was somewhat disappointing in the current fiscal year, that when we first did a projection, the historic increase in charter school assessments was usually met with a corresponding increase, roughly same dollar amount, in the revenue that came in from the state on aid to local communities, and that did not happen this time, so that was a decrease that affected our bottom line revenue. The only other number that we're showing right now as a big number here is the overlay appropriation annual amount of $400,000, no change there. General O&M budget, again, the increases are fairly minimal as we go across 2.2, 3.4 in public safety. That's driven by the increases that I spoke about. Public education is up by 2.96%. That's overwhelmingly the Walpole Public Schools. Minor increases in Tri-County and Norfolk Aggie. The 900 and change is all driven by the increase that we're able to make available to the school budget this year. Public Works, as I said, I'm expecting a change in that number when we get our final hauling contract numbers in. Hopefully by the end of the month we'll know where we are there. We've projected over a $100,000 increase at this point in the hauling contract. Two different contracts involved here. The disposal contract at Wheeler, Greater, and Millbury, that one runs for at least another 6 years, I believe. This hauling contract is the expiration of a 5-year contract. We're back out right now looking at 5-year plans. As I said during the message, we're going to be looking at a new system that not only will automate the process, but by giving residents greater access to recycling, storage, if you will, recycling containers, that will hopefully drive down the overall cost of solid waste that's disposed of. That's good news because a year from now, we hope to even be reducing that line, if at all possible, again, if at all possible, to reflect a reduction in overall solid waste disposal costs. The other cost increases, relatively minor as we go through the line there. The big one, a decrease in assessments and fringe benefits. I truly didn't think that we'd be at that position, but again, because of the rate savers, we're able to show that major decrease at this point. Overall budget increase 2.31%. The town meeting articles, last year we had a slew of them. This year there are only a handful. We're showing 10.7 for the settlement of the clerical union contract. There are some off-budget numbers in there as well for water and sewer accounts that add up to just under $2,000. So we'll be requesting that funding. That'll be a transfer within line items, likely from health insurance to fund the various accounts, because that's where the savings has come from. We have our $200,000 year 5 of 5. At this point, year 5 of 5, we'll regroup after this fiscal year, determine whether or not we need to make any additional changes to reprogram that going forward into fiscal 14. But at this point, I would say that through the efforts of DPW and identifying the roads that truly needed to be improved, we've done a fabulous job utilizing over $1 million in 5 years to make that a reality. The assessor's revaluation program, top end is $75,000. That'll be funded from overlay surplus, and we're holding $150,000 for the potential removal of the old library building. Revenues, the tax levy number is the only number that's changed dramatically. That's up by 1.6 and change, up to $54 million. The state aid numbers, as I said, roughly level funded. and I'll explain as we go forward. Total revenue for the town, $70,418,000 for the next year. As I said, the tax levy, there's your proposed, that's the only guaranteed revenue increase in the town of Walpole in the annual budget setting process. It is a function of last year's base number, the total last year, plus new growth, plus anything that would be in here for general override. And as you see, we didn't have anything for the current fiscal year, and we're showing right now, and I'll show a couple of slides in a few minutes what the impact would be, but it gives us the 1.26 available for next year. Combine that with the new growth estimate that the assessors have worked up at this point, roughly 500,000, gives us the total of 54.3 million. State and local aid, or state and local aid, I should say. Again, I won't spend much time on it because it is level. It is interesting, though, if you look at fiscal year 2009, you can see $11.4 million down to the roughly 9.5. It is that dramatic. Lottery aid, a number that was supposed to have been increasing, recurring to the communities. The last time it was shown as actual lottery aid was fiscal year 2009. Since that time, it has become quote-unquote general municipal aid and has decreased each year since, with the exception of this year being level funded. One thing to keep in mind in looking at the Prop 2.5 history is that lottery aid was supposed to be that cash cow, if you will, or that replacement source to bring continued revenue back into cities and towns. If the Commonwealth continues the practice of diverting lottery aid, as it has, then clearly the benefits are long gone as well. Local receipts, a couple of noted changes. We're going to recommend motor vehicle excise up about a $50,000 clip at $3.1 million next year. Our town fees we're going to drop. We're going to increase to $117,000. We also have, however, minor increase in licenses and permits, and investment income, however, we're going to drop by another $5,000. You can see that we went from $578,000 in 2008 to $38,000 last year is all we were able to generate in interest income. That is a loss of $540,000 in spending ability, revenue for the town of Walpole that has yet to make a comeback. Other available funds, again, a few noted changes here. The Prison Host Community Grant Program we're showing is a $30,000 amount that came in at $30,000 this year. The overall state funding is half of what it used to be way back in 2009. Now, glass half full, we've got $30,000 that we didn't have for 3 consecutive years. Glass half empty, we still have yet to recover from the cuts in 2009. I'll take the half full for the moment. No other specific changes at this point. We did move the registry of motor vehicles marking fees from this line to the town fees that I showed to explain the corresponding increase in that. To give you an idea on how we come up with the 6634 funding allocation, it's a simple math equation. Take last year's revenue, total at 68.8, the projected revenue of 70.4 at this point, and that gives you an increase in revenue of 1.56. The state charges and assessments difference, as I mentioned, is $6,686. That comes off of the 1.56. The overall offsets, however, decreased to us by 1.578, so that's also added back in, the total difference being 1.556. That's the amount of money that we start with in determining what's available for expenditure changes for the current year. First thing that comes off the top are what we call a non-discretionary cost. Assessments and fringe benefits, i.e. health insurance. The debt budget comes off. Anything from Tri-County, Norfolk, Aggie, and of course, as I mentioned, solid waste. Because the assessments and fringe benefits are decreasing by $122,000 total net, and that's driven largely by the health insurance decrease of over $200,000, balancing off some of the increases in Norfolk County retirement as well as the property and casualty lines, we show an increase of only $56,000 in non-discretionary costs, leaving literally $1.5 million available for department spending. It's important as we go forward to keep in mind that that number is not going to return to $56,000 next year. I would be hard-pressed to believe, standing here on February 6th, that I'll be here a year from now telling you about another 0% health insurance increase. I believe that we'll be back into a more regular cycle, hopefully not more than the 5% range that we typically would see. But that number easily could be 600,000 next year. So in other words, we're seeing a huge swing in what the overall cost would be this year that doesn't necessarily translate next year. That means that next year's availability of revenue for municipal and school will be decreased correspondingly. 66% of 1.5 million is 34,031,000, and that's the amount that's programmed at this point for budget into the school department for next year. As I mentioned, here's a quick explanation or description of where the money goes. You can see that in the overall split, 50.31% of the budget as spent goes into the schools at this point in time. That's all schools. That's Walpole, that's Tri-County, that's Norfolk Aggie. You can see that the other big drivers, if you will, assessments and fringe benefits are 18%. We actually spend more on that category than all of the other categories, not combined, but it's the next largest beyond the school budget. Public safety would be next at 11.4. Now keep in mind that that the 50.31% for public education spending is not all money that we spend on public education in the town. We actually have a large chunk of the assessments and fringe benefits line that's directed towards public education. We have funding that comes out of each and every one of those lines, if you will, that gets credited or counted, if you will, towards the net school spending and the annual school calculation figures. In fact, the FY11 numbers that the town accountant provided for me show, in fact, it is absolutely a 65.9% split school versus just under 34% for the town. So it really is a 66-34 split that we've been working on now for several years. For fiscal 13, you can see the numbers change. The numbers change only slightly. Right, I'll get the hang of this eventually. Because of the increase, assessments and fringe benefits will decrease in fiscal 13. Each of the other lines show a small increase in the overall expenditure or distribution. The balancing act, it shows 0. Those numbers will change. By the time we get to town meeting, we will know, have a better handle on what the House and maybe Senate will be doing with local aid. We will know where our trash budget is, so those numbers will change. But the ultimate game is to make sure that that number is as close to 0 as possible. In some respects, there are other schools of thought that would say that that number should be greater than 0 because then you're setting some funding aside. We're not there yet. Sewer and water, as I mentioned, 9.83. You can see that the water department is going to utilize about $940,000 in retained earnings expenditure out of a 1.9, and I don't have my number sitting right in front of me, but I believe the total is just about 1.9 today. Is that right, Rick?
I actually believe it's 1.7 because they applied 200,000.
Correct. I'm sorry, you're right. 1.7 currently. Our free cash status. I don't. It keeps me awake at night, and you'll see why in just a second. For capital next year, the coming year, we're projecting $582,000. That's part of the concern for me. The bigger concern for me is that in using free cash over the last few years, including $300,000 for this year's budget, we've taken the reserves, the litigation reserve, what used to be money in that snow and ice rollback, and operational reserves, amounts in those 3 lines that once totaled as recently as 3 years ago over $1 million, and we reduced it to $350,000 to be able to keep capital flowing and keep budgets flowing, etc. Now, we're not showing anything for the FY12 budget. We're not showing anything for OPEB at this point. We're not showing anything for stabilization fund. What I neglected to mention in my budget message, and just thinking about it, looking at the OPEB, is that we actually have identified one funding mechanism for OPEB for next year, for this year going forward. In the fall, we will look to transfer $100,000, money that we were able to generate back from the West Suburban Health Group as part of the Medicare Part D subsidy for fiscal year 07. So that's a recurring revenue stream that we'd like to tap into to help begin to fund that OPEB allotment that we're required to do each year per GASB. But we're not showing taking anything out of free cash at this time. And we're also not showing any snow and ice deficit. That day hopefully will not come if we can keep this going the way it is this year. And again, here's where we were in fiscal year. As we closed 2008, or in the 2008 year, looking to 2009, there are the amounts that are in excess of $1 million, plus our capital budget was $1.9 million that year. Again, if you think about it, we were certified at $1.44 million. That year, we were certified at 4.7. That's $3.3 million that's not available to us right now. Again, explaining the challenges that the community's been working with over the last 4+ years. Capital projected, we're going to show about $582,000 on equipment, services, building repairs for this year, $250,000 from the ambulance fund. There's been a huge, huge swing in the cost of that equipment over the last year. Ford Motor Company has dropped the most popular chassis that they've utilized, which has created a huge funding change in the F-Series, which is now their only availability, as well as some of the other larger chassis that would be used. Keep in mind, we only spent $147,000 thereabouts, just under $150,000 the last time we bought an ambulance. Now, not all of that is truck. A good portion of that is the medical equipment that will be purchased, including a new defibrillator. And we're going to propose borrowing $200,000 here again for road system improvements. Brings us to a discussion of the override. As I identified during the budget message, the total override request is $3 million. It's made up of a level services need for the schools of 1.3, system restoration, partial system restoration of 1.2, schools insurance, if we get that far with all those positions, at $200,000, and the municipal needs, the 5 positions I identified, including the insurance. And there are the 5 municipal positions. 2 in the parks, 2 in building maintenance, and 1 police officer. If we're maintaining our facilities, these positions are paying for themselves. If we're maintaining our fields, these positions can be paying for themselves. If we're utilizing these positions on even something as simple as snow and ice control, these positions help to pay for themselves. If we're utilizing a police officer to help reduce the overall incidents in the streets, that helps to pay for itself. As much as, and likewise, with the positions that would propose to be restored back to the school department. If you can keep services in-house and not have to outsource them on that side of the ledger, that helps to pay for itself. There is truly economies of scale here. Yes, it's a bottom line, but that bottom line is coming one way or another. It's either going to show up in the general fund budget, or it's going to show up at some point in time through major system needs, major facility needs, major equipment needs. The override impact, again, when I showed you the tax levy earlier, I showed you a tax levy without an override based in, and that number was $1.2 million for this fiscal year, 1.26. If an override is successful, we will place it right there, that $3 million number. And that $3 million number will then be added in with the 51.9, the 500,000 of new growth, and the 3 to give you a new starting point of 55.4. That means 1.385. And the reason I show you that is without the override, your impact is 1.31. It adds an additional $75,000 into the base going forward each year. It's not an additional $3 million every year. It adds it into the base now, which helps to restore the programs and positions, but allows us some additional flexibility going forward, not substantial, but brings the overall cost of the annual cost to the taxpayers down to a more manageable level year to year. And finally, my to-do list. First order of priority is to fund the school budget. And we're going to have to do that, and we're going to have to look at that through the override mechanism. But it's not just FY13, it's FY14 as well. And I know that the school committee has had these conversations about finding a way to make whatever we can do this year with additional revenue stretch out and last beyond FY13. We're going to hopefully in the next, as I said, the next month finalize solid waste contract. That will give us hopefully an additional revenue stream to put back into the current fiscal year. And if we do it the right way, will allow us some flexibility and some cost recovery in future years. I can't say it enough. I say it every year, and I know I sound like a broken record. We have aging facilities. We have more miles of roadway. We have more acres of land that we have to maintain. We've added playing field surface to allow for the increased demand in the community. We're doing all of this within the levy, but if we don't get the bodies necessary to make those things, I lost my train of thought. We can't maintain it. We're going to fall further behind, and the cost level will be huge. The money that we have invested in sprinkler systems and turf and equipment will immediately be thrown out the window because the fields will revert back to the conditions that were deteriorated to begin with. Our buildings, we know what we've got. We're doing a municipal facilities plan right now. We need to focus on that facilities plan and look at both municipal and school facilities going forward as to what the proper mechanisms will be to maintain those. And we need to rebuild our financial reserves. We've got it won't happen overnight, and there's no way at this point in time we're going to divert funding from programs and services to build up a nest egg. But if you think about what got us through this really rocky time, it was having $4 million in undesignated fund balance. The Commonwealth was no different. Under prior leadership at the House and Senate, they built up the rainy day fund. The rainy day fund was over $2 billion, and they were chastised for doing such a thing. Well, without the rainy day fund, the Commonwealth would have cut services to the communities far greater than they did over the last several years. We have got to start to take a page lesson learned there and begin to build back our revenue stream and build back our reserves so that we can address the next hit, because there will be a next hit. Without financial reserves that we've had, we would have been back to the voters a lot earlier than we are at this point in time. And lastly, we need to plan for the future. We need, as I just said, without beating a dead horse, come up with a proven cash reserve and management savings process. We need to replace our facilities, at least plan for the replacement of our facilities. We need to look to more community and economic development funds to help us do some of the outside programs, like redoing our downtown, bringing in infrastructure to our industrial centers. And the big key is sustainability. Whatever we do, when we get new revenue, we have to make sure that that revenue lasts, and we have to make sure that these budgets will be able to move forward from year to year. That's a combination of cash reserves, that's a combination of new revenue, and that's a combination of new ways of doing business, including working with all of our collective bargaining units to bring some relief. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Michael, thank you very much. I probably missed it though, and I know it's just a small amount of money, but what was the increase this year over last for the meals tax and hotel tax? It's not a lot of money, I understand. Just looking for any type of revenue stream.
We had projected we projected 310,000 this year. The first couple of months are showing an increase of, help me out, Mark, I think we're about 40,000 projected over that.
Question, what is you?
The meals tax, how are we doing with the increase?
I think we're projected to bring in about 400,000 this year versus 300 in the current year, or last year.
I have to double back and check everything, see where I put that. But we are expecting to see an increase. I want to wait and see how we get through the next 2 quarters before we actually go to the bank with all of it yet.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Snuffer Precinct 4. My questions are going to be related to override issues. I see them in a collective way listed in your presentation. Is it the intent to submit to the public one override or 2 overrides?
I'll yield to the policy setters on that one. My recommendation would be one number, 3 million.
Right, and by way of background, tomorrow evening we have the school committee coming in and giving us our first thorough look at their portion portion of the override. We as a board have not really determined much more than that.
Okay, relative then to its total of $3 million on the average taxpayer, average homeowner, what is the impact, please?
Your average home value in Walpole right now is just about $404,000. The projected impact is about $110 per million, $330.
$330. It is a general override.
Correct.
Each and/or together, there'll be a general override. If we take for a moment just the net capital effect of what $3 million means, and you take the interpretation of a general override which exists and lives forever, it essentially creates a conundrum that says, were we to have the same type of fiscal opportunity, we could build the long-needed police station and pay for it in 2.5 years. That's essentially what it says. So when you talk priorities, keep that type of fiscal thinking in mind.
Questions, comments, suggestions?
Michael, if we do not use, touch wood, the money we have earmarked for snow removal, what will that do, and where will those funds be dispersed?
What will happen is, let's say, what did I say, we have roughly 500,000.
Yep. We're putting off the improvements on the floors, roofs of 2 schools, correct? 2 or 3?
Just Fisher School.
Just Fisher School for fiscal 14?
Correct.
If we don't get additional funding, will that be pushed off any further? Or
No, it'll
what's
have,
the plan?
it'll have to be done. We'll do it as a borrowing.
I was wondering if you could go over the debt exclusion figures. I don't think it's often that during a public presentation, and one that's certainly broadcast, that we get to go over the debt exclusion overrides of the past, what those mean to the budget, and what those will mean to the budget in the future.
Fiscal 13. You see Boynton School, Old Post Road School, Adams Farm, etc. The numbers really start at the Old Post Road School as the Boynton School numbers, the original project that paid off. Those figures represent direct pass-throughs to the taxpayer. Those are amounts that were voted as Proposition 2.5 debt exclusion amounts. What those mean for the actual budget are a corresponding revenue to pay for the corresponding debt. So when the debt is paid off, so for example, I believe Adams Farm is done in fiscal 16, it's either 16 or 17, the net $471,000 that we pay out of the debt budget goes away, but so too does the revenue. So what you have is you have a net neutral effect on the overall budget. So when these projects reach their full maturity and are paid off, then that money goes away. The expenses are already gone and the revenue disappears. There's no positive gain on the budget when the debt is actually paid off. Now, what it does mean, depending on how you look at it, would actually suggest that, and we tried this, if you recall, we really tried this as part of the presentation on woodworkers when we went for that last year, is we showed what the corresponding debt drop-off would be over the next several years on excluded debt. And we were suggesting that it would be a net level equal, if you will, to the average taxpayer as that debt moved forward. In this case, if there are no new excluded projects put on the table, then that's looking at that number right there is $1.895 million that goes back into taxpayers' pockets.
That's good, thank you. The second part of the question is the figures that we see there, the debt exclusion figures, were overrides that were approved by the community and that are a set amount of time, as you said. They'll expire and that debt will fall off, so too will the revenue. Looking at the budget, one of the things that was very apparent was the fact that state aid has fallen off, lottery aid has fallen off in a year in which a town like, community like Westwood, next to us, is getting an increase of approximately 400,000, I believe, give or take, 300 to 400,000 in their Chapter 70 figures. Walpole is getting 0. So I guess my question is, when we talk about municipal and operational overrides, those are increases that stay indefinitely. Has there ever been an override done in any community that you know of that was done in the way a debt exclusion override is done, in that it is a tax increase for a certain amount of period that will eventually fall off? And my thought process on that is it would be a temporary increase over a period of 5 to 10 years that would make up for lost revenue and restore revenue that we no longer have from the state. That would not be a permanent tax increase.
Well, have communities considered essentially borrowing to pay for operational expenditures? Essentially just floating a bond to pay for the ongoing operations? I'm not certain that anyone's actually done it. Already shaking her head saying no.
You could do a one-time capital, but I don't think you could get away with doing an operational.
I mean, in fact, a capital exclusion is something that we could also look at in subsequent years if we get into a situation with needing to fund some big ticket items that would be a one-time, one hit, one shot, and see you later. And that's the very technical description of DOR is, one time, one hit, see you later.
Thank you. Thank you.